Welcome students to another in our Investigating Science series. Today we're in grade 5 and we're looking at food chains and feeding relationships. We will be guided by these questions. What are the roles of different organisms in a habitat? How can the feeding relationships between these organisms be represented? And of course, how do human activities influence these feeding relationships? Let's see what we can remember about how plants and animals relate in a habitat. So we know that a habitat is a place that has what is required for organisms to live, right? And we usually find plants and animals in a habitat, right? Good. And so in any habitat, we know that the animals are dependent on plants for food. Why is that so? Because generally, plants are the ones that are able to use the light energy from the sun to make food. And so we say plants are producers, right? And animals, we really don't make any food for ourselves, right? So animals depend on plants, and so animals are consumers. And so because of that, we know that plants and animals are dependent on each other. And of course, this relationship that shows how they relate to each other can be represented using a food chain. And that's what we're going to look at today. So here's a picture, right? This is something that we see around us in our gardens and open spaces where we live in our communities. You may see an insect like a bee go into a plant, go into the floor, right? And so the bee, or we have other insects, butterfly, and so on, they visit the plant, not just because the plant looks pretty, but because they want some juice, some nectar from the plant, right? Good. And so that picture is showing a particular type of feeding relationship, right? Yes. And so in that picture, the plant would be the producer, of course. Only plants can be producers. And the bee is basically eating or taking the juice from the plant. So the bee is a consumer. And so we can represent what is happening in that picture in a food chain. Now suppose that bee was now pounced upon by a bird, yes? And of course, at some point in time, that bird was caught and used to have some roast bird by humans, right? Good. And so I can represent that type of feeding relationship with that food chain. So it would move from the flower, which is eaten by the bee. So the arrow represents or indicates that it's eaten by. So the flower is eaten by the bee, right? Which is eaten by the bird, which is eaten by the human. And that would represent our simple food chain. All right, let's get into some more. Why are food chains important? So as we pointed out, it shows the feeding relationships in the habitat, but it's also very important for transferring energy in that ecosystem. So by eating, right, remember when we take in food, the food has stored energy, right? And that is what we use to give us the energy to do the different activities that we carry out. So by eating, right, we're transferring energy. So the food chains help in the transfer of energy. And so plants occupy that position of producers, and every other organism in that ecosystem, they would be called consumers. Now, What are the roles of these consumers? Are there different kinds of consumers? What do you think? All right, let's see. So, the consumers that only eat plants, obviously, right? They are given a special name. Good? That name is, they are called herbivores. So, the bee, for instance, would be a herbivore. We don't see bees eating other animals, right? They only visit plants. So the bee, the grasshopper, can you think of any more herbivores? All right, so these insects, animals, yes, they are herbivores. Now, as we pointed out, the bee could be eaten by the bird. So the bird is also a consumer, but in this case, the bird is eating the bee. So that bird is another type of consumer. All right, now there are some consumers that only eat other animals, right? So we know that birds also visit plants, so the bird could be a herbivore as well. Yes? Can we think of an animal that only eats other animals? Yes, lion comes to mind, right? So lions are consumers and they have a special name, and that would be carnivores. Good. Now let's look at ourselves. We're humans, we eat plants, and we also eat animals. Now there's a special name for those kinds of consumers. Yes, they are called omnivores. So omnivores, like humans, eat both plants and animals. Now in some food chains or in some ecosystems, of course, you'll always have an animal that is a predator and one that is the prey. So think about lions hunting other animals in their habitat, right? The lion would be the predator, and whatever animal it's pouncing on, that would be the prey, right? And so that would describe a predator-prey relationship. All right. Now, how is this useful? This is useful now when we're trying to make a food chain, all right? So we're going to be given this bit of information. Let's look at this. It says algae are living in a pond. So algae, in most cases, you may see some green looking thing growing in water. All right, we can refer to that as algae, or some person may say algae, right? Now, the mosquito larva eats the algae and is in turn eaten by the tadpole. The tadpole is then eaten by the fish, which is in turn eaten by a fisherman. Okay. So, we want to use this information to create a food chain. So, based on what we just presented, we can pick out what is the producer. So, remember, your food chain should always start with a producer. So, it must start with a plant. So, the algae or algae would be the producer. And that, we're told, is eaten by the mosquito. So the next organism in that food chain would be the mosquito. And the mosquito is eaten by the tadpole, and so that would be the next organism in that food chain. And of course, the fish eats the tadpole. Yes? And finally, humans would eat the fish. So that information is represented in our food chain. So, looking at that food chain, can you identify the role of each organism? What's the role of the algae? What's the role of the mosquito? Based on what we spoke about earlier. So, the algae, we said, is the producer. The mosquito in this food chain would be a herbivore. yes, the tadpole and the fish and man, we would all be consumers, and we're consuming, in this case, another animal, so they would be carnivore, right? Very good. All right. Now, how do human activities affect a food chain? All right, so we're going to look at another scenario. So we have a rice field, and in that rice field, we have birds and locusts. So the birds and locusts in that field eat rice plants, right? And the birds also eat the locusts. So we can use that information to create a food chain. All right? Good? So we're starting with our rice plant. What eats the rice plant? Locust eats the rice plant. We know that birds also eat the rice plants, but the bird also eats the locust. So we can represent that information. Rice plant eaten by a locust, eaten by a bird. Now, here's what happened. Because the birds are eating the rice plants, there's this farmer who owns this rice field who decides, okay, I'm going to kill out all the birds. Yes? Because he's trying to protect his crops. Good. Now, this is a question we want to look at. How will killing the birds affect the number of locusts in the field? So look back at our food chain. Rice plant eaten by locusts, eaten by bird. If I kill out the birds, what would happen to that food chain? Would the number of locusts increase or decrease? Yes, they would increase because there would be no bird now feeding on the locusts. But if the number of locusts increased, how would that affect the rice plants? Yes, more locusts would feed on the rice plant. So, although the farmer has taken out the bird out of that food chain, right, he will still have more problems because the locusts, swarms of locusts, can actually destroy a rice field with these plants, all right? And so, generally, nature has a way to balance itself. So, the bird population would have helped to reduce the number of locusts and, of course, help to save the plants. So it's very important that we know that human activities such as pollution, what other activity could affect a food chain? Dumping of garbage, cutting down of trees, right? Building, constructing in a particular habitat can actually affect the organisms in that habitat, and of course that can affect the food chain. I mean, many times our fishermen complain that they cannot get any fish, they cannot catch anything because probably in some other area they had overfished, yes, or they had dumped something in the water that polluted the water. So all these activities can affect a food chain. All right, you're going to explore a habitat in your surroundings, all right? And this is what you're going to do. You're going to take a walk to this area. You're going to take pictures of what's happening, write down your observations, look and see what is eating what, see where insects are visiting plants, if birds are eating insects, whatever. You just look around you and write down some observations. And from that, you want to be able to determine what is feeding on what is a feeding relationship, and you're going to actually try to create some food chains based on what you see happening in that habitat. Now, using some information that we had before about the different food chains, we're saying that you can make and create these food chains, write down the organism that's functioning as a producer, the names of the other organisms that are eating these producers, right? Create your food chain. Make them interesting. Instead of having just the words, you could have a picture of a locust, picture of a rice plant, picture of a bird, picture of a man, and that is your food chain. And then you try, of course, to hang these food chains all around you to make your mobile food chain. Good, and that is how we would try to use that information. All right, so what did we learn today? We're reminded that food chains show how organisms feed and interact in a habitat. And of course, as we pointed out, each organism has a special role, and so that can be represented, right? Using arrows, we can show what each organism is eaten by. And please remember that human activities such as pollution, hunting, constructing buildings, overfishing, all of these can affect organisms in a food chain. And as we saw earlier, if we affect the population of one organism, it will affect others in the food chain. That's all for today. We ask you to go on the outside, observe these feeding relationships, make your food chains so you can understand how plants and animals are dependent on each other. That's all for today. See you next time on Investigating Science.